Existing as you are apparently wasn't a choice. I say apparently because the universe is so vast that we can't ignore how small we truly are. But from an early age, something about you stood out, like the world around you was out of sync with what you felt inside. And no matter how hard you tried, you never quite managed to mold yourself into what others expected. Words always carried too much weight. Other people's gestures often felt hollow. And what seemed light to others felt strange to you. Like there was always a static hum between who you were and who the world wanted you to be. The uniqueness of existing carries a silent burden. At times, it feels like a gift. This ability to see what others don't. To pick up on subtleties that escape distracted eyes. Other times, it feels like a curse. Because the more you notice, the more you suffer. You feel everything more deeply. There is beauty, yes. But there's also absence, contradiction, misalignment. And it's in that space between what is felt and what can be expressed that loneliness begins to grow. And when all of that becomes too heavy, the temptation to become someone else arises. Someone who seems to move more lightly through life, who appears satisfied with shallow conversations, fleeting distractions, and a way of living that doesn't question too much. But that lightness, deep down, is only an illusion. We never really know what another person thinks, feels, or carries. Judging others' lives as easier is a common illusion when you're tired of holding up your own internal world. What looks simple on the outside may hide things even deeper, or just a different way of surviving. It's not easy to live in silence when everything inside you is screaming. It's not simple to hold your whole self together when the world keeps asking for fragments. And yet, you keep going. Because even without an instruction manual, even with no guarantees, there's something in you that chooses to continue. Even when no one understands, even when it feels like there's no space for the depth you carry in your chest. Sartre once said we are condemned to be free. Maybe that's it. You didn't choose to be this way, but now you must choose what to do with it. And choosing to be who you are, even when it feels like there's no reward for it, is one of the hardest decisions anyone can make. But the pain of existing this way doesn't come only from what you feel. It grows sharper when you realize how little the world around you seems to meet that same intensity. And that's where the real wound opens, in the excess of perception and the lack of reciprocity. You notice things others ignore. You feel before you even understand. You grasp without needing to hear. And though that's a rare gift, it's also what sets you apart. Because the more you pick up on, the more you see what others are missing. And the more you notice, the more you feel out of place. It's not about being superior, not at all. It's just a kind of sensitivity that doesn't quite fit in a world that runs on haste, masks, and the comfort of appearances. There are moments when all of this makes you wonder if there's something wrong with you. That maybe the problem is feeling too much, noticing too much. That maybe you should be more shallow, more normal. But when you try to force yourself into that role, something breaks inside. Because pretending doesn't soothe. It only delays. And every time you silence what you feel, the loneliness deepens. Not because you're alone, but because you can't be whole, even when you're with someone else. Jung said the soul becomes ill when it cannot live its truth. And the truth, in this case, is that you see what many avoid. You feel what many deny, or simply don't even notice. Your pain doesn't come only from within. It also comes from the constant effort to translate what you feel into a language no one seems to speak. It's like walking through a city where everyone wears masks, and for some reason, you can't keep yours on for long. This sensitivity, which doesn't impose but observes, is both a bridge and an abyss. Because it connects you to a deeper layer of existence, but separates you from those who only live on the surface. And it's in that gap, between the deep connection you long for and the superficiality that surrounds you, that the feeling of being strange begins. Not strange in a negative way, but strange like someone walking through a different emotional landscape. Denser, more subtle, harder to share. And so, over time, you start getting used to walking in silence. Not because you want to, but because it's become easier than trying to explain what can only be understood by feeling. With time, you've learned to hide certain parts of yourself. The parts that were too sensitive, too intense, too sincere. Because those were the traits that first drew rejection. When you showed vulnerability and weren't embraced. When you spoke your truth and were met with indifference. Little by little, you started to understand that existing deeply isn't always welcome. So you began to retreat. To hold back. To stack inside yourself everything that didn't fit into someone else's gaze. Jung called this the shadow, the psychic place where we throw everything we learn not to show. But what goes into the shadow doesn't disappear. It stays there, alive, waiting for its moment to rise. And when we don't make space for those fragments, they consume us. The pain of being different doesn't come from the difference itself, but from the exhausting effort of hiding it. Because sustaining an edited version of yourself is a form of self-abandonment. You begin to wonder if it would be easier to be what others expect, more predictable, more normal. But it isn't. Because there's a part of you that resists, that even when silenced, still insists on living. That part wants to breathe, even if it's been cast aside. It wants to exist in full. And no matter how hard you try to suppress it, it comes back. In unexplained pain, in anxiety that won't leave, in dreams that haunt you. Accepting this shadow doesn't mean falling into pain. It means making peace with everything that is yours. It's understanding that even the parts of you others tried to erase have value, and that being whole doesn't mean being constantly accepted. It simply means not betraying yourself. You don't need to show everything to everyone, but you do need to know, deep within, that everything you are has the right to exist. Because suffocating who you are just to maintain the appearance of normality, that's what truly makes you sick. And when you start to see all of this, you also begin to realize that the root of your pain often lies in comparison, in the unconscious desire to be like others, to adapt, to fit in. But comparison is deceitful. It's born from an illusion, the belief that there's only one correct way to be. Sartre said that the other is always a mirror, but not every reflection is true. Sometimes what you see in others is just a projection of what you think you should be. And that distorted image becomes an unfair standard by which you measure your own worth. Without realizing it, you start to shape yourself to fit, lowering your voice, swallowing your questions, forcing smiles. Sartre called this bad faith, a state where we pretend to be what we are not, just to fit into what others expect from us. And even though that might bring some relief for a while, it also disconnects us. Pretending is surviving in silence. And no one can bear that for too long. Being true to yourself hurts, yes. But losing yourself hurts even more. Comparing yourself to others is forgetting that your path is unique. It's trying to harvest fruit where there are only seeds. It's always thinking the grass is greener on the other side. Comparison, in that sense, is a subtle poison, because it seems harmless, but it slowly erodes your peace. And when you finally stop measuring yourself with someone else's ruler, you begin to see how valuable you really are. You want to be seen, but you're afraid to be exposed. You want closeness, but you fear not being understood. You want to give yourself, but you've already learned how much that can hurt. Living with depth also means living in constant ambiguity. Simone de Beauvoir said that the human being is, by essence, a paradox. We seek freedom, and at the same time fear the emptiness that comes with it. You long to connect, but you also protect yourself. You want to be embraced, but you guard the most sensitive parts of yourself like old wounds no one is allowed to touch. And maybe you're right. Not everyone deserves access to the truest parts of you, because not everyone knows what to do with depth. Many get scared, others pull away. And there are those who will try to turn your truth into weakness. That's why you hesitate. You stay somewhere in the middle. Never fully open, but never fully closed either. Always there, on the edge between the desire to belong and the fear of disappearing into someone else. That contradiction is part of the human condition. Simone de Beauvoir wrote that to live authentically is to accept the ambiguity of our existence. We are, at the same time, free and limited. We want to be strong, but we also want to be cared for. We desire freedom, but we suffer with the loneliness it sometimes brings. And maturity isn't about choosing one side over the other. It's about recognizing that both exist within us. She said that trying to be just one thing, strong all the time or light all the time, is a rejection of our human condition. To truly live is to embrace this mix, and that takes courage. Not the courage to impose yourself, but the courage to accept yourself. Jung also saw this inner conflict as an essential part of individuation. To become whole means to welcome opposites without rejecting any of them. And it is in this acceptance that the deepest form of freedom is born. The kind that doesn't deny pain, but transforms it into presence. Life will never be completely clear for those who feel too much. There will always be gray areas, unresolved doubts, gestures that cannot be explained. And that's okay. What matters isn't having all the answers, but being able to move forward even with the questions. Ambiguity is part of existence, and accepting that is the beginning of a more genuine freedom, one that doesn't demand perfection, only presence. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its opposite. The like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. The Kybalion principle of polarity. When you understand this, something inside you begins to shift. The acceptance of ambiguity brings with it a new clarity. That walking away from what diminishes you is not selfish. It's respect. You stop blaming yourself for needing silence, and you begin to recognize that silence can be home. Not every departure is a loss. Sometimes it's freedom. You spent so long trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. You forgot what it feels like to take a deep breath away from others' expectations. Not fitting in hurts, yes, but it also sets you free. Because the moment you stop trying to belong at all costs, you begin to discover who you are without interference. There's a strange kind of joy in realizing that you no longer need to follow any model. That you can wear your truth without asking permission. That you can walk crooked paths without having to explain them. Jung saw the process of individuation exactly this way, a moving away from the collective in order to find the center of your own being. And as lonely as it may seem, it's that very distance that creates the space for self-knowledge. You stop looking for approval and begin to listen to your own intuition. You stop asking others to tell you who you are and start remembering it on your own. That doesn't mean rejecting the world, but no longer begging for a place in it. Being different is exhausting as long as you're trying to mold yourself. But it becomes light the moment you accept that you didn't come here to repeat what already exists. You came to be what only you can be. What once felt like isolation now begins to reveal itself as fertile ground. The absence of belonging gives way to the presence of self. And little by little, a new way of being in the world begins to take shape. Without masks, without copies, without noise. The world may still not understand, but for the first time, you begin to understand yourself, and that is worth more than any forced sense of belonging. There's a certain calm that arrives when you stop forcing yourself to be where you don't want to be. When you realize that silence isn't a punishment, it's a shelter. That not being among many can be healthier than being surrounded by those who don't truly see you. The world keeps trying to associate solitude with failure, as if a person's worth were measured by how many voices surround them. But you know, deep down, you've always known that being alone was never the problem. The real problem is being surrounded and still feeling invisible. Over time, you learn that not every empty space needs to be filled, that there are places within you that only bloom in stillness, that there are ideas, sensations, understandings that are only born when there's no one around to distract you. Jung said that retreat is necessary for the process of individuation, not to reject the world, but to build an inner world strong enough to sustain you when everything out there feels like it's falling apart. This solitude doesn't close you off. It filters you. It protects you from the excess, the noise, the rush. It brings you back to yourself. And when you learn to dwell in it lightly, everything changes. External demands lose their grip. Internal pressures begin to dissolve. You stop comparing yourself, stop blaming yourself, and let go of the urgency to fit in. Gradually, you start living more truthfully, even if it means walking with fewer people. It's in that clear space that you can finally rebuild yourself, without needing to please, without having to justify, just by being. And the more you allow yourself that silent peace, the more it becomes your foundation. Not as an escape, but as a refuge. Not as protection, but as a home. A place that's yours alone, where you can always leave when you wish, but where you know you can always return. You don't need to be understood to have value. That's one of the hardest truths to accept when you feel deeply, because there's a part of you that still hopes that someone will see you, someone will understand, someone will reach the depth of what you feel. But that doesn't always happen. And not because you're too complicated, but because most people live in a place where it's easier not to see, where it's more comfortable to ignore what can't be controlled or explained. Sartre said that we are free to be whoever we want, but that this freedom condemns us to bear the weight of our choices. And among those choices is the decision to remain truthful, even when no one understands. It's a lonely decision, but a necessary one. Because the risk of losing yourself trying to be liked or accepted is greater than the pain of being misunderstood. Integrity is costly, but it's worth more than any approval. Hiding yourself to be accepted is too high a price to pay. What you receive in return isn't belonging, it's conditioning. People end up loving a version of you that doesn't even exist, while your truth slowly withers in silence. And eventually, that hollowness begins to make you sick inside. Because no one can live disconnected from themselves for too long. Being yourself, even in silence, even without applause, is a form of resistance. A way of affirming, day after day, that your existence doesn't need to be explained to deserve respect. And when you begin to hold that presence, the world may not fully understand, but it starts to notice. Because there is something powerful about someone who doesn't ask for permission to be. Something that doesn't need to be explained, only felt. You spent so much time thinking you'd never find someone who understood you, that you almost convinced yourself it was impossible. And sometimes, it really does seem that way, because the kind of connection you seek isn't common. It's not satisfied by automatic gestures or rehearsed phrases. What you're looking for is rare, a recognition that comes effortlessly, a gaze that doesn't need subtitles, a presence that doesn't make you hide. But that kind of connection doesn't happen when you're pretending to be someone you're not. The hope of truly being seen only begins when you start seeing yourself honestly, when you stop chasing those who never really listen, when you let go of the idea of reshaping yourself just to be accepted, and finally, allow your essence to breathe. Jung said we can only truly find the other when we are no longer lost from ourselves. It's at that point of wholeness that real connection begins to happen. They aren't loud. They're not always quick, but they are real. And when they happen, something inside you settles. Because for the first time, you don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to translate every gesture, justify every silence, or soften every emotion. You can just be. And that, after so much time feeling out of place, is like finally finding solid ground after wandering through deserts. Hope then stops being a fantasy and becomes a possibility. Because you begin to understand that you don't need to be seen by everyone. You only need to be seen by someone who has also chosen themselves. By someone who has also felt what it's like to not fit anywhere, and yet still remained faithful to their essence. It's in that meeting that true belonging is born. The kind that doesn't imprison you, but confirms you. Being yourself has always come at a cost. It hasn't always been beautiful. It hasn't always been accepted. Sometimes it's been lonely, exhausting, painful, but it's also been real. Because in the midst of every attempt to adapt, in the middle of every swallowed silence, every restrained word, every hidden tear, there was something inside you that kept resisting, that didn't want to fade, that still believed being whole was better than being accepted at the cost of yourself. The pain of being who you are doesn't go away. It transforms into strength, into clarity, into discernment. You begin to understand that you no longer have to justify your intensity, your sensitivity, your truth. That you no longer have to fit in, only to hold yourself. And little by little, that pain gives way to something much rarer. Something you may have waited your whole life to feel without even knowing it. The quiet joy of never having betrayed yourself. Because there is something deeply satisfying about not having given up on yourself. About staying true, even when no one was watching. Even when the world seemed to have no place for you. There's a strange but profound joy in looking within and recognizing everything that survived, everything that was cared for, even in the midst of exhaustion, everything you chose to protect, not out of pride, but out of love. That's why each of us knows the pain and the delight of being who we are.